All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Lexel Blue webinar series, Customizations, Extensions, and Integrations. We're glad you can join us today as we explore how to enhance and extend Costpoint through customizations, integrations, and tailored solutions that support your unique business needs. To make this session more interactive, we'll have Teams polls throughout, so be sure to participate and submit your answers. Once you hit submit, you'll be able to see how others respond right in the meeting chat. We're hoping it makes it a fun and engaging experience. We'll also have a Q&A at the end, so once we reach the Q&A slide, please post your questions in the meeting chat, and Paul will address them during the session. If we don't have time to get to everyone's question, Paul will follow up via email. After the webinar, we'll be sending out a session recording, a copy of today's slide deck, and a bonus handout with helpful tips and takeaways. So no need to worry about capturing everything. We've got you covered. Now, let's get started. I'm excited to introduce our presenter, Paul Geyer, a platinum consultant here at Lexel Blue. Paul brings deep experience in designing and implementing Costpoint customizations and integrations that help clients streamline processes, improve performance, and get more value out of their systems. Paul, take it away.
Thanks, Megan. I want to thank you all for attending. I'm very excited about sharing this overview of extensibility with you. As you can imagine, this is not much of a party conversation, so it's really cool to get to talk to people who won't fall asleep while I'm talking. We're going to stay pretty high level. We're going to keep the technical jargon to a minimum. But if you've got any questions, as Megan mentioned, we'll be monitoring the chat and we'll try to get to them. By the end of the session, my goal is that everyone here will have a firm grasp of the capabilities of extensibility and how they fit into your environment. So before we begin, we're going to start with a poll question. How many extensions do you currently have in your environment? Megan will bring that up for us. And this will give me an idea of the experience of the group that we've got. Okay, here comes the question. So while this poll is running, I'm going to ask a second question. But we're not going to put the second question on the screen because I don't want you to hurt my feelings. What would you say is your gut reaction when you hear extensibility? So looking at the chat now, let's see what we've got on our summary. It looks like we've pretty wide range here, kind of even across all of the responses coming in. So I guess we'll keep this generic. That's good to know. Okay, thanks for responding with that. So usually when I talk to people, we start talking about extensions. They usually fall into one of three categories. The first category of people I talk to, you see extensibility as like a black magic. Maybe you know what extensions kind of are. You know they can do some pretty cool stuff, but it all seems magical. Some developers do some hand waving, but from a manager's perspective, it's hard to see how they fit in, how we budget for them, or where the pitfalls are. I at least claim that I'm older than I look, even with my gray hair. But I remember a time when managers could not manage software development projects. They were still new, and there was all kinds of ideas of how to manage it, but everything was just kind of getting started. When I was in school, managers had a joke. You could slide pizza and Mountain Dew under the door, and a developer, and an application would just appear. I was a computer science major, so of course we had grander dreams and more pride than that. But I got to admit, it wasn't a coincidence that my school had the busiest Papa John's in the world. Nowadays, we've probably all managed some software project, but extensibility can be a little bit different. If we completely black box them, we don't understand the full process, so we can't evaluate alternatives, risks, future costs. We can't even build a business case for it, right? So today we're going to look at the Costpoint architecture and we'll see how extensibility fits into that. The second group I often see extensibility as their special key. These are the people that when you're in a meeting and you end up with a problem, the first answer is extensibility. You don't have enough manpower? We'll make an extension to automate it. We aren't getting reliable data entered? We'll build an extension to validate it. We want to skip a step in a process? We'll use an extension to get around it. Extensibility ends up being like caulk to fill in the gaps. The problem is that the gaps are usually process or data related. So the extension just covers up a problem. Over time, the problem gets worse, so we use more caulk to hide it. And we're living in a house that's all caulk. Extensibility is a great tool, but your foundation for your financial system is cost points. If you aren't designing around your foundation, extensibility is not going to make it right. And then I think this group is the reason that we see the third group who see extensibility as a money pit. With this group this big, we've got almost 100 people here. I'm guessing that there's a couple people in this camp on this call. And if so, I've got to say, I'm really grateful that you joined us to give extensibility a second chance. Some of you probably can tell me horror stories and maybe still have scars from the projects where you worked on. Maybe those projects were from a group that tried to use these extensions to fix process or data issues. Or maybe it was overtailing Costpoint to a particular individual. I had a CFO that asked me a question. Do you know what the only financial system that's worse than the one you currently have is? His answer was the next one. It's funny because no matter how old, clunky, slow your system was, the moment you get a new one, everybody seems to discover just how miraculous the old one was. However, things get ugly when you start using extensibility to make the new system work like the old one. You start changing screen layouts that make it difficult to maintain. You got to keep making updates. And then eventually, you're 5 years into a project and you're maintaining a screen to make it look like this old system that you got rid of years ago. The old system doesn't even look like that anymore. So for this group, at the end of the presentation, I want to convince you that there's a business case for extensibility and that can add value and we can keep it maintainable. It doesn't have to be the money pit that sometimes they become. So whatever group you're in, through the presentation, we're going to cover enough details so that you feel comfortable with how they work, how they fit in your environment. You'll understand the limitations, so you're applying them to the right situations. And we'll cover some estimation basics, so we can put this in a business plan and make sure we're getting value out of our investment. First thing we'll do, we'll talk about terms. There's some things that you put 6 people in a room and you get 12 definitions. But in this presentation, I've got the microphone, so we're going to use my definitions for this afternoon. In the presentation, we're going to talk about integrations, and we're going to focus on moving data from one system to another. However we do it, if we're moving data between systems, we're going to call that an integration. Extensions will be when we're customizing Costpoint. Anytime we're modifying Costpoint to look or behave differently than it did out of the box, we're going to call that extensibility. Given those two definitions, I'm sure you guys can see that there's going to be some overlap. Sometimes we might be focused on moving data, but we've got to customize Costpoint to make that work. That's okay. We're going to fit those projects into that green diamond in the center. So what kind of scenarios would we use integrations? One of the most common I see is bringing employees from an HR system. Chances are we're entering the employee's name, salary, supervisor into an HR, an onboarding, or a payroll system. And we don't want to have to re-enter all that data again into Costpoint. Same goes for payroll journal entries, credit card expenses, timesheets, inventory. There's a lot of times we have data in some other system, and we just want to save ourselves the work of re-entering it. On the flip side, maybe we have the information in Costpoint, we want to get it out to another system. Maybe we want to pull vouchers to feed a disbursement system. Maybe we want to pass financial systems up to a parent entity. There's something that we have in Costpoint that could feed some other process, some other system. Traditionally, these are done in batches. We schedule them to happen at certain times of the week or the day. A lot of times these are file transfers. And we say, hey, at 10 o'clock at night, I'm going to take everything from this system and move it over. But there might be instances where we need more real-time integrations. For example, maybe we want to compute tax on a voucher or an invoice through a tax engine. We want to do that when we build the voucher and not wait till the end of the day. Or maybe we're in Costpoint and we want to go pull information from another system because we need a decision made in Costpoint on that screen, and they just don't have enough information to make the decision we want them to make intelligently. Whether we like it or not, we're in the world where we have multiple systems to get business done. We can't do all the business with one system. But with integrations, we can get our systems working together to make one environment instead of managing multiple stovepipes. That's the promise of integrations. Extensibility is where we're customizing Costpoint. Costpoint really has an impressive system that can handle all kinds of scenarios. Lexo Blue has helped implement Costpoint for a Fortune 500 international company. But most of us probably don't require the complexity that Costpoint can support. Our range of scenarios are much smaller, and we don't need all of the bells and whistles. So maybe hiding a screen, hiding a field, or setting a default would make it much more intuitive for our users. Along the same lines, maybe we don't have the range of possibilities, so our validations can be more tailored. We can improve that data that we're getting and give a little bit more information to the user. Some of these we can do through user profiles, but most of this would require some level of extensibility. Extensibility can be as small as adding a default value, or it can be as complicated as adding a full screen. The key is we want to focus on what we need to change to make Costpoint work better for us. Not necessarily a preference, not a what would it be, what would I design Costpoint if I were building it, but what would bring value to the company. And then we're going to talk about that green diamond in the center. A lot of times integrations and extensions overlap. Particularly if you're not maintaining an integration platform such as Boomi, Ocado, MuleSoft, etc., your two systems won't be able to speak the exact same language. Each system stores data a little differently, they name fields differently, and so we usually have to do some translation. Because Costpoint's extensibility is so flexible, it's often used to teach Costpoint the language of the other system. That way, Costpoint can talk to the other system directly, and we don't need any middleman. We'll talk about the pros and cons of this approach a little bit later. But in general, this can be a very accessible way to start your journey in integrating those two systems. So now we understand the concepts. We've got our definitions set up. Let's look at how these fit into the Costpoint architecture. Now, this is a very, very high-level overview of Costpoint from an extensibility perspective. I'm sure we've got some technical people on the call, So I'm going to take a little bit of time and put a disclaimer in here. This diagram is not an attempt on how to architect in a distributed environment. We're not dividing this up by servers, how we would install this. I'm not trying to walk through the WebLogic JVM. This diagram is a simple representation of how extensibility fits into Costpoint. As simple but as complete as I could make it to visualize what's happening. So, disclaimer over. Hopefully I don't get beat up by any of the tech guys after the call. But let's talk about the diagram. In the center, we've got this circle that is Deltek Costpoint. That's going to count everything that we see as Costpoint. All the arrows coming out will be things that go outside of Costpoint. To the right of the circle, we see our databases. This is where we hold the information. In our system databases, they hold the information associated with users, preferences, even how Costpoint screens look. Those are what govern Costpoint as a whole, right? Below is our transaction databases. These are usually what we think of when we think of the Costpoint database. They hold the information like our employees, our projects, orgs, vendors, financial transactions, you name it. Now, a note, the databases can hold some stored procedures, little functions that do stuff to our data. They have some logic. But mostly, these are tables that are holding data. In the center of the circle, we see the application, that box. We talked about some stored procedures that happen in the databases, but most of the logic of Costpoint is in this application box and is written in Java. You'll note that the extensibility sits next to Costpoint code here. In extensibility, we never change Costpoint code. We just add additional code to the system. I generalized all extensibility as Java within this application. It all fits in the box. But we do add a couple of folders for database scripts for creating tables, some stored procedures, customizing Costpoint when we package that file. Also in Costpoint, we're going to talk about one common integration, and that's the bottom left. You'll see our alternate file locations, or AFLs. Those allow us to put files on a Costpoint or linked server that extensibility code can then read and process. Generally, these files are structured. They may be what we call comma separated, where each row line is a single row, each column is divided by a comma, or they may be fixed length, where we say each column is so many characters. But the extensibility can read those files, process them, and put that data into our transaction databases. This is the same process that native Costpoint preprocessors use for importing files. And this can be very effective for loading large amounts of data at one time. When we put these extensions together, you'll see them packaged as a zip file. It'll have our Java code. It will have SQL scripts to the transaction and SQL scripts to the system database, all in one zip file, which makes it easy for us to store, makes it portable, makes it nice when we're having to refresh our environment. So we've covered the inside of the circle. Let's talk about the arrows coming outside of the circle. The first one, easiest one, is actually one we don't think about very often. That's the bottom of the page, the web server. We don't normally think about it as an integration, but this is what's allowing our primary external entity visibility. This would be our user. Whenever our users access Costpoint, they're accessing it through an HTML page generated to that web server that allows it to talk to the application. The next one will go up is ODBC. For those wondering about the acronym, it stands for Open Database Connectivity. but really it's just a way for us to talk to the database. For those of you running Costpoint on-prem, you'll have access to the database. But for those running in the cloud, this is going to be limited to read-only. The idea of an ODBC is that it's direct access to the data without any of the overhead of the application. You'll notice that that ODBC is talking straight to the database and we're not running through that box of the application. A decade or two ago, this was the de facto way of working with systems because it was fast, reliable, and allowed you to do pretty much whatever you wanted. However, getting to do whatever you wanted also comes with a lot of dangerous stuff. Nowadays, there's still applications for ODBC, but we want to be really careful about changing Costpoint databases directly. There's a lot of validations, processes, and logic that happens within the Costpoint application, and it's very easy to miss a step. This can lead to very problematic data in your system. Also, for those of you running in the cloud, this ODBC connection can only be used through a special driver. That can get difficult to work in different environments. Also, the data might be slightly older. It may not be by much, a few minutes, but if you're working in a highly transactional environment, that delay can be problematic. So if you're running in a high transactional environment, wanting to use an ODBC in the cloud, you should work with a partner or Dell Tech directly, make sure that it's meeting your needs. So we've talked about some of these concerns, some of the risks, some of the dangers of ODBC. What would be our alternative? On the left side, we see web services. Web services, if you're not familiar, are like web pages for computers to read. They still use the HTTP, most of the fundamentals that we're used to in the web pages, but instead of HTML, they use XML or JSON, just a different language, a different vocabulary. These are very powerful utilities in Costpoint called the integration utility, and it actually allows us to expose every screen and action in Costpoint as a web service. The advantage is that you'll notice that that web service runs through that application box that we talked about the database is not going through. This means that almost all the logic, the validations, the processes within Costpoint are still applied when we use the web services. So it's very hard for us to do something in Costpoint through a web service that Costpoint wouldn't allow through the front end. This makes the transactions much more trustworthy. And if we get an error or a warning, it's a lot more intuitive, it's a lot more explanatory of what's going on. So let's talk about web services for a moment. The market's moved to web services or APIs. In fact, I would wager that nearly every web page you visited today and most of the financial transactions you've made have been over web services. Why is everyone using web services? First, in web services, we can just ask the system to do something for us and let it handle all the computations. Instead of us having to understand the database, having to know what it means to save a voucher, all the tables we have to touch, all the validations we have to conduct, we can just give Costpoint an object and say, hey, save this object, or ask Costpoint to perform an action for us, and it will do the action. We don't need to know all the details, all the behind-the-scenes computations. We just let Costpoint do what Costpoint does. That means that whatever's calling it can stay in its own swim lane, and we don't have to teach every system what every other system does. Second, because of the decoupling and the standard technology, we're less tied to a particular vendor. When we need to switch systems, our voucher, our timesheet, our employee, the attributes of a particular document or entity aren't going to change very much. We may change the name of those attributes. We may have to put them in a different order or structure them a little differently, but our process stays very similar. So we can make a small tweak and not be tied to any particular system every time. And finally, because we're taking that logic and leaving that in Costpoint, we can use the tools we like. If your developers are Microsoft centered and they want to use C#, no problem. If you're leveraging low code solutions, you can roll that out. We're not tied to a particular set of tools or language, because all we need to do is generate that entity, that document, and give it over and let the logic be done in Costpoint. So, as I mentioned, web services are very powerful. Costpoint has implemented them and given us so much flexibility in how they're done. But I want to give a warning on how Costpoint web services are a little different than normal. In a normal web service on the left side, you'll usually see an endpoint for each particular object. If I want to add an employee, I will have an endpoint for adding an employee, and I will give the attributes of an employee straight to that endpoint. If I want to give a voucher, I would have a different endpoint. I'll go to the door, I'll say, hey, here's my voucher. The process will take the voucher, it go do its thing, and come back to me. Costpoint uses a very generic solution. So it has one endpoint for reading, one endpoint for writing, but those are the only two endpoints. Whether you're applying a voucher, an employee, a project, whatever you're sending, it's always the same endpoint. And that means that our document gets very generic. Instead of just sending an employee, the top level has a document that says, hey, I'm going to do an employee import. Under that document, we have a row that says, hey, I'm going to do an employee. Under that row, we have data. And then in our data, we now have the attributes of the employee. Again, the intent here is not to bore you with the technical details, but for those of you that are using a third-party integration system, or your developers are used to web services, I want to mention this because this can kind of throw off a developer the first time they see it, if they're not ready for it. It's a very effective way of applying and exposing all of the endpoints, but it does take a little bit of getting used to. So the next polling question we've got is, I want to ask you, how many of you have an internal team that's familiar with web services? Megan's got that up very quickly. Thank you, Megan. Perhaps you have an iPaaS solution already, or maybe you've coded some web services in other systems. Maybe you're even using Costpoint's web services, but kind of get an idea of how many of us are kind of used to it. And it looks like we have a lot of people who are used to APIs. And so I hope I haven't put you guys to sleep in the last 3 slides, but we've got a couple that are getting used to getting their feet wet with web services. So that's great. So since you guys are familiar with web services, you guys know these strings. They're JSON. We know what the authentication is. Costpoint rules are enforced. And it's a fairly short runway to get web services running in Costpoint, especially if you have a team that already is familiar with web services. We can help you publish the service. Your team can start consuming them, and you can be on the road very, very quickly. Now, that was integrations. Let's talk about what it takes to do extensibility. When integrations, we said we could use our own tools. We could use our own technology. We had a lot of options in what we used. Unfortunately, with extensibility, we have to stay within the Costpoint environment. That is going to limit our tool set because we have to fit within what's already there. We need to know Java, we need to know SQL, and depending on your database, this will be either Microsoft or Oracle. We need to have a working knowledge of Costpoint and a familiarity with the extensibility tools. A lot of times that working knowledge of Costpoint gets missed because, hey, they're just developers. But you have to work within the Costpoint API, within the Costpoint screens, within the Costpoint database. And if your developers don't have a working knowledge of Costpoint, that can get very intimidating. And it's very hard to catch all the business rules that are happening within your environment. Now, we can do some things without this entire tool set. For example, hiding a field would only require us learning the Extensibility Manager. But there's not much we can do without knowing SQL. If we want to add a field, if we want to add any logic, we're going to have to know that SQL to create the tables, stored procedures. And then if we want to do advanced logic, we want to do computations, transformations, file handling, user interaction, we're going to have to start leveraging Java. And then, as you guys can imagine, that also follows the Java API. Fortunately, Deltek helps us with that. They give us documentations, they give us Java docs, they have a manual for how to get started. Now, I can't talk about extensibility without giving some warnings. Extensibility can be a very dangerous tool. I feel like I should quote Uncle Ben and warn that with great power comes great responsibility. There's a lot of examples of well-meaning engineers that worked in extension only to cause a bigger problem. You can do a lot of dangerous things, and then if it gets messed up, you're calling a partner like Lexo Blue, not only to fix the extension, but maybe to fix Costpoint environment itself. So I've compiled not a comprehensive list, but I compiled a list of warnings so you keep in mind as you're going through this to look out for. First one is Deltek does not consult your extension when they develop or deploy updates. If your extension rearranged the screen, maybe use some blank area to put a new field in or something, a future Costpoint update may resort the fields. Maybe they added more stuff that used that blank space you were hoping to put your field in, and it's hiding your new field. Every time you get an update, you'll need to check those screen layouts to make an update. Or maybe you made an assumption in how Costpoint did a process. Maybe you only assumed a certain number of columns, maybe you assumed a certain order, and a future Costpoint extension made an adjustment for multi-currency, multi-company, all kinds of other items that you didn't account for, and you can break the Costpoint process. Second, extensions can operate outside of Costpoint's validations. Similar to as we talked with changing a database directly, an extension can allow you to do things like put a one-sided entry in the general ledger. You could delete items from a subledger. That's going to have a serious problem in your Costpoint instance, and you're going to start relying on corrupted data. So if you're doing things in the database, you need to be very careful, you know, what you're changing and what those implications are. Third, for those of you in the cloud, I believe Deltek maintains a code review SLA of 5 days, and they can only apply updates during maintenance windows. So if you have a problem with an extension, it could take you over a week to get that fix deployed to production. The code review, the scans, the maintenance windows, those are all protections to make sure that that environment stays stable. But if you run into a problem, you can't expect to have your extension fix deployed in an hour. You have to realize that you've got a time frame there. And lastly, extensions will only ever run in Costpoint. If you've got key business logic that's running your business and you put it in your Costpoint application, from a corporate side, you're limiting yourself to only work with that single vendor. All of your future updates have to be in that particular technology. All of your developers have to know that tool set, and you can never migrate it. So we've talked about capabilities and pitfalls of both integrations and extensions. What would they look like to add to our project plan? How do we estimate and how do we plan for these projects that we might want to add? With software development, little details can change a process drastically. For the country music fans out there, as Joe Diffie would say, when you're spinning around, things come undone. Welcome to Earth, third rock from the sun. So little changes can make some big differences, but I tried to put some guidelines here to group these into general categories. When we're looking to add these integrations, we don't want to just count how much it takes to develop. We also want to count how much time it takes to test, documentation, and deployment. So for the easy side, I have listed basic file imports using a preprocessor. I would rank these in about a week. This is assuming that you're getting the file from the other system. The beauty of the preprocessors is Deltek has done a great job in documenting these files. They're usually comma separated, a fixed length. They give us the fields, they give us the specifications, and the preprocessors themselves are fairly consistent. So we've got lots of documentation. They've been well tested. They're used quite a bit across the industry. So if we've got the file, getting them processed, running it through some tests, validating our data is fairly low-hanging fruit. On a simply more difficult side, on the medium, I would say these are around 2 weeks. These would be simple file exports and exposing a standard web service. Simple file export would be generating a comma-separated value file, maybe some report data without much transformation or business logic. And then a standard web service would be exposing a screen or action that's native to Costpoint. Again, you may be asking, why does it take me 2 weeks if I've got the extensive integration utility? But we have to remember, we expose the screen and the integration, we test it, we deploy it, we release it on the other side. So we're not going to do that in a day. And then third, hard elements are things that I would say you should plan for 4 weeks or more. This would be things like building a new preprocessor, a file export that has complex translation logic. Basically, if we're not fitting within the basic Costpoint screens and data, we're going to need extensibility, and that's going to make the project significantly more difficult. In the medium, the simple file export is going to have a little bit of extensibility, but with just writing files, most of your devs are going to be able to have a template for that. It's fairly straightforward to get it to the file writer, so we can still count that in the 2-week period. Let's talk extensibility. How would we estimate on extensibility? Again, we're going to break this out into easy, medium, hard. I'm going to kind of aim at these a week, 2 weeks, and 4 weeks or more. And what the main limiter here is what tools we need. For the easy at the bottom, these are changes we can make with just the extensibility designer. We still need to get these tested and promoted, but if you're familiar with the designer tools, these can be done pretty quickly. They're small edits, so testing becomes very simple, and so we can move these through the process very quickly. On the medium, the 2-week mark, these are things that we require SQL. Adding some basic tables, some auditing. As long as we're not doing complex computations, these are pretty straightforward. SQL becomes a little easier to debug, troubleshoot. These are fairly simple tests, so we can get these deployed and through the process a little bit quicker than the top ones. When we get into hard, Now we're leveraging Java. Now we're talking file operations, complex logic, calling web services. These don't only require more design and development time, but they're harder to debug. They take more time to test. And because they're so complicated, our test cases are higher. So we've got to give ourselves enough time to get through all of this testing and give the devs enough time to work through the code. So we've got the basics of the architecture. We understand the capabilities and pitfalls, and we've got an estimate on what the level is for each one of our projects. So on our last polling question, I want to ask you guys, how many of you have an upcoming integration or extensibility project? And how soon is that project on your list? And so we're going to look through some of these. And I would tell you, Lexo Blue has a great team of developers, decades of experience. Whether you're looking for your first web service call or you want someone to build out an entire integration, they've got someone on the team. And it looks like we've got quite a few. They're looking at it pretty quickly. So I guess we did this presentation just in time. Some are wrapping up 6 to 12 months, okay? Well, while those are coming in, I've told you about the team. A lot of these people are my friend, all this team is my friend. And I want to tell you a little bit about my friends. The first one is Ying. Ying is a true whiz. If you talk to anyone familiar with Costpoint extensibility, they're going to know Ying. He's worked on some of the biggest implementations, and he stayed on the cutting edge of technology. This is the guy that programs circuits and sensors to monitor grill temperature and pass out Halloween candy. I'm not kidding. I've known Ying since freshman year of college, and I still count him as one of the smartest guys I know. Also, there's Kate. Kate has literally decades of experience with Costpoint. Truly amazing understanding of the database. She understands Costpoint inside and out. Not only has she supported Costpoint and done extensions, she actually used to write Costpoint itself. She wrote the calculate bills and IRO modules, which, as you guys can imagine, are very, very complex. Kate's awesome to work with. Yes, I see Kate is amazing. I agree, Donna. And she's great to work with. We've also have Erica. Erica comes from a formal software engineering background. She's got experience in highly technical and cloud-based technologies. She was part of a team at Dell for a management utility that provided a common platform over all the major hosting platforms. It used web services to work with Azure, AWS, Google, you name it, and control it from all a single pane of glass. She understands the cloud, the technologies that make it work, and she writes some of the most elegant code I've ever seen. And then finally, myself, I want to thank you all for attending. Thank you all for the time to listen. I've come from decades of IT management experience, and I like helping companies maximize their value in IT investments. I hope this presentation has been helpful and that you've gotten something useful out of it. Before we close out, I know we've had a couple of questions in the chat. If you have a question that you haven't asked yet, if you want to put it in the chat, we will try to get to it. And if you think of something after this meeting, like, hey, I should have asked this, my email address is up here. Feel free to reach out. Be happy to help and give some answers where I can. After this presentation, we'll be sending you the slides and transcripts as well. Megan, do we have any other questions in the chat that I've missed?
I think that we have caught up to all of the questions asked, but if there are any more, this is definitely the time. Put them in the chat.
Okay. Well, we have one more slide, but Megan, I think we can stop the recording.